So I will just let you join your seats so that we can start the plenary session A. Okay. Thank you. So we have one of our speakers who is now coming back to the floor, and then we'll start the session. So good morning. My name is Carole Chapin. I am from the French Office for Research Integrity, and I will be sharing this session. Once again, I thank the speakers of the opening session for their talk at the beginning of this Congress, and I thank all of you for being here today. I have now the pleasure of opening the plenary session A on societal challenges of research integrity, societal dimension of research integrity. We will begin with a presentation by Stéphanie Ruphy, who is Professor of Philosophy of Science at the École Normale Supérieure and Director of the French Office for Research Integrity. Stéphanie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carole. Okay, so what I would like to do today is to share some questions and some thoughts with you about what I think is an important and emerging challenge for research integrity. And this challenge is raised by an intensification of various forms of engagement of researchers. So as you probably have noticed, this phenomenon has certainly intensified recently and in relation, specifically in relation with issues of, specifically in relation to climate issues, but not only. So to some extent, of course, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, there's a rich and long tradition of engagement from scientists taking political responsibilities. And we heard Senator Pierre Ouzoulias just before, who happens to be also an historian and archaeologist. But the focus on my talk is going to be on another type of engagement from scientists. This is the cases where, as a scientist, as a researcher, you mobilize your knowledge in your specialty, in your field, to support or to defend a certain line of actions or a political agenda. So you may recognize at the center of the slide with the white coat, you may recognize the geophysicist Rosa Abramoff, who got fired a few months ago from an American lab, the Oak Ridge Laboratory. And the story is that she attended a meeting of the Geophysical Union, and she went on stage with a sign reading out of the lab and into the street, so calling for more political engagement of the scientist. French audience will, of course, recognize Valérie Masson-Delmotte, who is a very famous and respected climatologist. So what's interesting is that she was president, one of the vice president of the IPCC for some years, but after having stepped down a few months ago from this vice presidency, she became much more visible in the public sphere, and she somehow left behind this so-called neutral stance of scientists and be more active to speak out recommendation and critique, political critique and recommendations. So let me first distinguish. So what I want to do today is to investigate possible tensions between societal engagements of researchers and expectation towards science in terms of research integrity. I might have a few, at the end, suggestions of practical recommendations. Okay, so let me first distinguish between different types of societal engagement. Let's start with the most obvious one, activist research, militantism. What I mean by activist research, I mean that as a scientist, as a researcher, you develop a line of research because you have in mind to serve a certain line of actions or political agenda. For instance, when you study biodiversity, that might be because you are interested in protecting biodiversity. If you study recycling plastics, you might be interested in, I don't know, diminishing the environmental impact of plastic and so on, or when you study animals because you want to defend some rights or things like that. So this is what we call today activist research. And a way to do that as a professional scientist, a way to do that is also to become involved with what is called a certain type of citizen science, which is called co-created or community-based research. So what do you do in this case? As a professional scientist, you bring your expertise, you bring your knowledge to a group of people who, which has certain interests, and you help them making things happen or solve their problem. Okay. So this is the first, obviously, obvious form of engagement of researcher. Another obvious one is that as a scientist, as a researcher, when you go on a TV set or when you tweet or anything, you are involved in public or political life as an expert, okay? And the third form of engagement, which may be not perceived as such, but which is, I think, actually the most impacting one, is our responsibility as regards the steering of research and the choice of research priorities and research topics. I will come back on that a bit later. Okay, so let's try to map the tension of these different forms of societal engagement with key elements of research integrity. So let me first start with a quick preliminary note on terminology. I think it's when we talk about these issues, it's very important to distinguish between impartiality and neutrality. Impartiality, that's what we want in science. It refers to grounds for accepting a hypothesis or result. And what we want, of course, is value-free science. You don't want your choices as a researcher to be influenced by, I don't know, your metaphysical, religious belief, political preferences, economical interest, you name it. Okay, but in the real world, of course, we know that we sometimes don't achieve value-free science in that sense. So at least we try to minimize all kinds of biases that affects scientific inquiries. And we all know that we are not too bad doing that. We have internal mechanisms to do that, like peer reviewing. We try to reproduce things. And even if it's not perfect, it's certainly much more efficient than what other type of discourse on the world manage to do. Okay, this is impartiality. So neutrality is something else. Neutrality is about the consequences of a choice, of a decision, be it accepting a hypothesis, choosing a research topic, for instance. And so if you go for neutrality of science, that means that somehow you dissociate between production of scientific knowledge and what happens next, what people do of this knowledge. Its uses, its impacts. And so the difference is very clear if you think about a judge decision. You want a judge decision to be impartial, but obviously the judge decision is not neutral. It does impact. It has far-reaching consequences for people concerned. So in science, we want impartiality, but neutrality is hard to defend. And I like this part of a song by Tom Lehrer, who was a mathematician and a songwriter. You might know him. So I'm a very bad singer, so I'm just going to read the line. When the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun, and we all remember the role played by the German engineer during World War II. Okay, so when we search for impartiality in science, and this is the obvious link with the research integrity, so I'm going to use impartiality as a shortcut for key elements of research integrity. So we want to prevent misconducts, questionable research practices that might arise because people doing the scientific inquiry have interest. The list is long. Examples of these misconducts: selective reporting, cherry picking, various cognitive biases like intra-group favoritism, confirmation bias, we know them very well, ostrich effect, and the list is long, lack of reproducibility, of course. And so the key question is, when as a researcher you are engaged, do you have a risk of having more of that than in the rest of science? Because of course you always have something to defend when you do science. It's not like, okay. So do you have more risk here? And also very important, because we are talking about research integrity and we're talking about, trust in science, credibility of science, quid of the perception of an increased risk lack of impartiality. Because if you don't have in the real world an increase of impartiality, but you have a perception of it, you're not happy either. Okay, so let me start with the first kind of engagement. I'm going to be very quick because as regards research integrity, there's nothing much to say. No particular risk of a lack of impartiality. There's no specific tension with research integrity when you have an impact on society because you choose to prioritize that or that topic of research. And of course, depending on who you are in the academic world, your leeway to have an impact will depend. But that's, I think, a very important responsibility for researcher. Okay, so it's a strong non-neutrality. Well, the choices made when we set the research agenda does impact society, obviously. So it's a strong neutrality, but usually there is a very weak perception of this non-neutrality. When we think about scientists being engaged, we don't think so much about this part of responsibility, and I do think this is the main one, actually. Okay, or the most impacting one on society. But that's not the topic today, so let's focus on this one, involvement in political and public life. So my main message is that scientists can choose between different roles as experts when they enter public debate on their... so let me just... and what I always show this typology by Roger Pilker in his book, The Honest Broker, 2007. And I'm not going to comment the details, but what's interesting is that as a scientist, as a researcher, you have the choice between different roles as an expert. Pure scientist, issue advocate, science arbiter, honest broker, policy alternatives. Very quickly, you may choose a researcher to be, when you become an expert at interacting with other components of society, to stick to the stance of pure scientist. You focus on research with no consideration for its use and utility, and without connection with decision makers. In that case, if you choose this role as an expert, then neutrality, there's no special risk of lack of impartiality, and there's no risk of perception of a lack of impartiality. Most common today in public life, issue advocate. What you do is that you use your status as scientist to argue for a cause or line of actions, vaccines, defending biodiversity, whatever. So you may also, as I said, you may also align yourself with the group seeking to advance this interest. In that case, as an expert, you assume your non-neutrality. Oh, sorry, I forgot to. Anyway, you assume your non-neutrality. But I think, but this is an empirical question, very likely there is an increased risk of perception of lack of impartiality and tension with research integrity. Now, if you go for another one, the honest broker, so just to give you a sense of the choices you have as a researcher. So it's often via committees you seek to expand or at least clarify the scope of choices for decision makers by integrating knowledge with stakeholders' concerns, okay? In that case, you do have neutrality because you're not deciding at all or you're not supporting directly a line of actions. You might hope for a less strong perception of an increased risk of lack of impartiality also. Okay, so just to wrap up on this part, what to expect in the democracy with this type of engagement of scientists? Well, of course, first and foremost, you have the same expectation than in the rest of science, research integrity, sure. But in addition, I think it's very important for democracy that when you are an issue advocate as a scientist, and there's nothing wrong with that, or there's nothing wrong with being a pure scientist or another type of engagement, you have to be honest and transparent on the fact that you are talking as an issue advocate, or you are talking as a pure scientist, and I don't think it's done enough in public life today. Okay. Okay. Now the last one, when you engage in political activism, militantism. So obviously there is a strong perception I think, of a lack of impartiality. There is a higher risk of a lack of impartiality. Empirical question: to what extent does that impact the credibility and trustworthiness of science? I know that there are European projects trying to investigate this dimension. So let's wait for the conclusion. And I will just conclude with this slide. So obviously, the degree and nature of tensions with research integrity vary with the type of societal engagement. That's why I wanted to distinguish between 3 types of societal engagement. And to simplify, to oversimplify, there are, at least in the current discussions, 2 ways to go, especially as regards activist research or strong engagement in the public sphere. So some people define the idea that you do have a professional duty to avoid activist research. So, defending a cause while doing the research, and doing the research to be more well-equipped epistemically to defend the cause. So professional duty to avoid activist research because it does increase the risk of questionable research practices, not to mention the issues of perception of a lack of impartiality. Or other people say you may choose to try to strengthen the reliability of the activist research by developing specific internal control mechanisms, guidelines to mitigate a higher risk of impartiality. But researchers are free to engage in this kind of research. Of course. Okay, and so I think down the line, the key empirical question, and maybe some of you have some elements of answers, is quid of the perception of activist research as research integrity? Because even if you manage, and there are ways to do that, if you manage to mitigate higher risk of impartiality, how do you mitigate the risk of having a higher perception by other components of society of tension with impartiality and research integrity, and hence trust? Thank you.
Now? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would now like to open the floor for questions. So we have a first question over there. Someone will provide you with the microphone. Okay. Maybe let's start there. And I've seen you over there. Please introduce yourself before asking your question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jacob Ambrosi from KU Leuven. Thank you very much for this presentation, Professor Ruphy. So I would like to ask a question about one of the assumption of your presentation. So you say that we of course want science to be value free, but we cannot achieve that. So we try to make it at least biased as least biased as possible. And so I think that one of the assumption here is that value-free science is bias-free science, so that they are somehow synonyms. But I think, of course, in the light of the broader debate on value-free science, that there are good reasons to think that not all influence of values in science can be detrimental to the integrity of research. I can imagine, for example, if someone is proposing a study showing very controversial results, for example, showing that there is a significant difference between level of intelligence between different genders or racialized groups, we want that person to we want those results to stand to a very high level of scrutiny. We want more evidence for that result. So in this way, our values legitimately change the level of evidence we want our epistemic standards. So yeah, I just wanted to know what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah.
How would it change the picture that you have so nicely
No,
for us?
I totally agree. I mean, this was clearly oversimplified. So you are alluding to the famous philosophical argument of inductive risk put forward by Hodner in the 50s already. So yeah, absolutely. When I said value-free and minimize biases, it was completely oversimplified. But I had only 15 minutes, Carol told me.
Yeah.
So I completely agree. This was oversimplified, and there are many other ways why actually the ideal of value-free science has been dropped now by most people and for good reasons. And so yes, it was oversimplified, but that is Carol's fault because she didn't give me more time.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we had another question up there. Can you raise your hand again? Thank you.
Thank you for this great presentation. I'm Iris Lechner from the VU Amsterdam, Netherlands. And I have a question about academic freedom. So can you maybe reflect a little bit about activist research and academic freedom? Because I can imagine that in unfree states, a lot of research isn't allowed. So any kind of research that the state or others wouldn't allow would be a type of activist research. So would you reflect on that
Yes.
a little bit?
Yes, I mean this would, yeah, I would have loved to develop exactly what you're asking, because we see immediately the tension when you think about, okay, do we have a professional duty to abstain from certain kind of research? It seems to be immediately a limitation of our academic freedom in our freedom to choose our research topic. But the example that was given by the previous person was interesting. I mean, the philosopher Philip Kitcher wrote a very nice book about that, Science, Truth, and Democracy. I mean, the question is, on certain topics where you know that the societal impacts are bound to be negative for certain groups of people, should we do research on these topics? And that was, for instance, the example you gave. And if you answer yes to this limitation of academic freedom in the sense of choosing your research topic, then you can consider it's a limitation of academic freedom, but only in the sense of which kind of topics we are prepared to fund. Because of course there's an infinity of research questions we can ask about the world, and we have to make choices. And so you may have arguments saying that an acceptable limitation of academic freedom as regards the choice of topic in a well-functioning democracy is to say, okay, if this kind of research, for instance, research on IQ, or the cognitive capacity of certain ethnic group or other subgroup of the population, is bound to produce negative social effect, then you can say it's a political decision in a well-functioning democracy to say, okay, let's not fund this research. Let's not ban it, but let's fund something else. I think, okay. So yes, you may have good grounds to not to censor some kind of topics, but to say, okay, this is not the priority. Let's fund another kind of research.
Thank you very much. And now, last but not least, I would like to open the floor for questions from our online audience, because we also have a great online audience. Welcome to you too, and thank you for being there. So do we have any raised hands? I'm not sure I see any hands up there. Okay, so if there is no question online, then thank you very much. And it is now time to give the floor to our second speaker, Oldrich Tuma, who is a researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History at the Academy of Science of the Czech Republic and the president of its Commission for Research Integrity. Oldrich is the current president of ENRIO. And Oldrich, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I would like to say that this is really a great honor for me to address you in the opening panel of such an important event as this Congress is. And also I would like to mention that this presentation is a collaborative work prepared not only by me, but also by the whole international board members of ENRIO. So I prepared it with more than a little help of my friends. All of us understand to some extent that research integrity is extremely important for science and research, but also for the dissemination of research results. We also more or less agree on what research integrity is, although there exist different definitions. So I will quote one of those definitions in spite of all of us know what it is about. So this one is, I think, taken from the Code of Conduct of our Academy of Sciences. So the quote is, research integrity is the adherence to ethical principles and professional standards in the conduct of scientific research. It encompasses honesty, transparency, and accountability throughout the entire research process. Researchers are expected to maintain high standards of integrity to ensure the reliability and validity of their findings. This includes accurately reporting methods, data collection, analysis, and results without fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. Research integrity also involves respecting intellectual property rights, maintaining confidentiality, and disclosing any conflicts of interest. Upholding research integrity is crucial for building trust, promoting collaboration, and advancing knowledge in the scientific community. We thus agree on what research integrity is and how to respect it. Still, it is obvious that different disciplines perceive it in different ways. My own discipline, historiography, is certainly quite specific in this respect. The most common, fortunately not frequent, violation of research integrity in the field of historiography is plagiarism. Manipulating primary data in historiography, that's mainly archival documents, or even straightforward falsifying them, is really very exceptional. Nevertheless, history, just like other humanities, is often exposed to the pressure of the world of politics and media, which both tend to use its results and frequently in a very distorted form to further their own ends. This was very tangible during the communist rule. At that time, the historical interpretation was supposed to become a part of the only correct explanation and interpretation of the meaning of history. It is the interpretation based on Marxist theory of class struggle. After 1989, it seemed that this indoctrination and manipulation of research by ideology and politics would forever be a thing of the past. To tell the truth, however, even today, there are still opinions suggesting a need to create an official historical memory. And I think it's not just the case of my country, but also some other countries. So official historical memory supported and disseminated by the educational system, media, and state institution, at least through research funding. And so it happens especially after the Russian aggression against the Ukraine. So the purpose is good, but sometimes the method could be dangerous. Risks such as those outlined above do not pose a threat in natural or technical disciplines. However, prematurely or improperly communicated information on research results can cause problems and harm even in their case. We were able to witness this phenomenon when the COVID pandemic was peaking. Some certainly well-meant interpretations and promises of researchers were one of the factors which caused growing mistrust in science. We could thus see a strangely paradoxical situation. The extraordinarily fast and successful reaction of research to the pandemic was accompanied by spreading of disinformation and mistrust in science, research, and consequently also the state. How should such pitfalls and problems be perceived and dealt with together? However, whatever the case may be, trustworthy and responsible research has never been as important as it is now. And exactly the same applies to cautious and reliable information about its results. Without public trust, even the most brilliant research results are of limited significance. Upholding principles of research integrity and ethics is extraordinarily important in this respect. Today, the research landscape is fastly changing. Research integrity as a field of practice has matured as well. 10 or 15 years ago, our focus was on defining good practices, making a list of behaviors, counting as good or bad. The research integrity community nowadays has very much matured beyond the code of conduct phase, facing new challenges and conceptual issues. In the last few years, we have seen a tremendous storm of evolutions, trends, changes, and so on, making the research landscape looking already very different now than 10, 15, 20 years ago. This fluid way of many different changes at the same time comes with great challenges. I will quickly sum up 10 current winds, making the perfect storm. The aspects listed above are by no means exhaustive, and they are not ranked in the order of their importance. However, they are perhaps illustrative enough of how the research integrity landscape is rapidly changing and how extensive it is. One, changing publication practices have made new challenges for unethical behavior. Open access has opened the quest for the best business model behind scientific publishing, but we now have predatory practices, paper mills, and more, compromising the quality of our published literature. Open science, from data management leadership of registered reports to preprint publishing on archive in other preprint servers. We are connecting our research with the European Open Science Cloud. What does this new way of doing research mean for integrity, reproducibility, and replicability of studies? Think of the so-called replication crisis in research and the popping up of national reproducibility network all over Europe. Many behaviors may foster reproducibility and integrity at the same time. Or trust in science has very much changed since the COVID pandemic. It shows growing divides. Some have a deepened trust in research, some have turned their back to science. What is the role of integrity for trust in science? 5, science communication has grown in number of phases, from experts and social media to citizen science involving non-trained people to endeavor in research practices. Development is going rapidly and with the challenges for ethical behavior of the scientists. 6, whistleblower protection has seen recent attention with the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization Guideline 37002, whistleblowing management systems guidelines, the EU directive being transposed to national laws. And the moment we speak, it happened in Czech Republic something like 2 months ago, and ENRIO's own landscape analysis with policy recommendation on the protection of whistleblowers in the research integrity procedures. Research assessment slowly but surely turning away from narrow bibliometric indicators with San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment DORA. It was mentioned a few minutes ago, and 10 Principles of Leiden Manifesto about research metrics, and QARA again mentioned in speeches before, and many others as driving forces. We all know that rewarded behavior is promoted, so the link with research integrity is very clear here. Security and openness has become a topic of attention since geopolitical challenges grew last years. How to keep our strategic autonomy as a knowledge economy while defending the principle of openness of knowledge, which is fundamental to our European research enterprise. 9, artificial intelligence, of course, cannot be forgotten on this list, and as everyone talking about changes has to mention the challenges we face by the magical new opportunities of generative artificial intelligence, including large language and image models. ChatGPT can be a great source of creativity help, but research faces no creativity crisis, but a replication crisis. 10. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion have been a point of attention in society for many decades. The last years, it has rightly received particular attention in academia and other research settings. An inclusive research culture is key to have the best science, both within institutions as an international collaboration, especially with the Global South. Last year's Cape Town statement amplified this important message. This list is just exemplary of the fluid way of changes coming to our working environment nowadays. Now think of the dinosaurs, if I may use the metaphor, dinosaurs seeing the volcano erupt and the dark storms following it. There is one big similarity and one difference between the dinos and us watching the fluid way of changes to European research. The big difference is that the dinosaurs could do nothing to change their future. But we can. The research landscapes across Europe are to a large extent self-steered and self-regulatory. It's the research community who decides how and where to publish. It's research integrity officers who design investigation procedures. It's funders who choose incentives. It's research institute policymakers who reward. It's senior scientists within or outside of academies of science who write the codes of conduct for research integrity. In summary, it's us. It's us, the research community at large, and the research integrity and research policy community in particular, who actively shape the research integrity landscape in Europe through our daily actions. These actions and choices are rooted in our insights and beliefs, what works best, how to do it most efficiently. Today and tomorrow are important days for all of us, the research integrity community, because it's on rare opportunities like these that we can share our insights and beliefs, and we make them common beliefs. That's what your heroic task is for today and tomorrow. I mentioned the big difference, but also see as a big similarity with the word of the dinosaurs watching their apocalypse. The living ecosystem in the dinosaur age was very diverse. Giant land carnivores like Tyrannosaurus rex, flying pterodontos, small actives, and enormous herbivores. It was a zoo of all shapes, colors, sizes, and dietary requirements, and so are we. This ENRIO Congress brings together a whole range of people who can contribute to the conversation about research integrity, each from their unique roles. To this Congress, we have registered participants in all of the following categories: research integrity researchers striving to better understand the world of research integrity and its challenges; senior scientists, academy members, and committee chairs deepening their knowledge of research integrity and writing codes; research integrity officers, ombudspeople striving to resolve conflicts and reach fair conclusions; investigation committee secretaries and lawyers striving for fair mediation or investigation procedures; research policymakers striving for the best policies rewarding good science in every possible meeting; other staff from research institutes and funders integrating insights from these days into policies and practices; service providers from training companies to publishers contributing their part in the research integrity ecosystem. So we are very diverse, but we are all valuable. The future is shaped by exactly these profiles. It means by us. All of us will be shapers of tomorrow's research integrity landscapes. Luckily, this room is a unique melting pot crossing both country borders and job function borders. It is an honor for us as ENRIO to enable the fruitful exchange between you as a diverse group of people. And yes, we are indeed diverse. One more example, we are now preparing a major national conference on research integrity in the Czech Republic. But most of the topics which the conference panel will discuss are in fact very different from these which will be dealt with here. But this does not mean our goals are not identical. As a matter of fact, I believe that researchers in various disciplines and also in different national contexts are very well aware of what constitutes a violation of ethical principles of research without having to learn formal rules by heart. After all, and this is my experience, these principles are based on the sense of honor, general intelligence, shared values common to all of us, and moreover, devising and implementing tricks that violate general rules of research integrity is, fortunately, at least sometimes, more demanding and complicated than abiding by these rules. The objective of ENRIO is not to produce and codify additional firm formal rules, but to create and maintain a room for discussion, exchange of experience, understanding of specifics and differences inherent to various disciplines and national contexts. To find common foundations and strengthen them, bearing in mind that we do not want to eliminate the variety, but to understand them today and tomorrow here and within ENRIO in the long run. ENRIO is committed to be part of this future. We have the ambition to play our role in the research integrity community, transcending our traditional role as only a network of national offices. That began when the European Council of Ministers mentioned ENRIO in its Council conclusions in 2015. Today, the European Commission asks EU-funded projects about research integrity to include structural collaboration with ENRIO. We discussed it intensively yesterday. Our most visible contribution to Europe's research integrity future is that we took the initiative for organizing these European congresses on research integrity, so we actively bring together the research integrity community in Europe. This one is the second ENRIO Congress, and we plan to organize one every year when there is no World Congress, pretty much like the alternating World and European Football Championships. After some years of incubation, we published our ENRIO handbook for whistleblower protection in research. And this week, the first articles appeared on RIPE, the online bulletin about research integrity practice in Europe. Both the handbook and RIPE will be officially launched in a session today or tomorrow, to which I all invite you. So a moment ago, I told you it's our heroic task to shape the future of research integrity together as a diverse group. With this reminder, I will end my opening keynote and wish you all a fruitful ENRIO Congress. The future is ours to shape, and ENRIO is willing to contribute. I hope you are too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oldrich. Thank you for your attention. So is there any question after this presentation? Okay, because we are running a little bit out of time, I think I will just look if there is any question online. No hands are raised. So for the timing, it's it's a good news, but of course you will have a lot of time to discuss all this over coffee break in a little bit more than 15 minutes. So I will now give the floor to our third talk, which is a joint presentation by Lissa Roberts and Cyrus Mody. Cyrus Mody is a professor of history of science at the University of Maastricht, and Lissa Roberts is emeritus professor of history of science at the University of Twente. Cyrus, Lissa, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Now, we've all come together to discuss research integrity. But Cyrus and I have noticed when we looked at the program that the emphasis seems to be on integrity. The word research seems to be a given. Defined by the European Code of Conduct, there you go. Defined by the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, as the quest for knowledge obtained through systematic study, thinking, observation, and experimentation. Now, we want to argue instead for a definition that transcends the conventional distinction that's made between internal content, that is, the knowledge practices in which researchers engage, and external context, the practices, resources, and institutions usually seen as enabling and constraining these knowledge practices. In turn, this more inclusive definition of research necessitates a reassessment of how research integrity is understood and monitored. So that's our basic argument. Our conception considers content and context as an interactive whole, encompassing all the institutions, businesses, individuals, practices, and resources that together form a trajectory of which research's knowledge practices are an integrated part. This trajectory is akin to what economists call global value chains, defined as the full range of activities that actors engage in to bring a product, in this case research, to market. So let's see what this means. Let's start with the, there we go, full range of activities. This includes pre-planning and design, whether by individual researchers, research institutions, or funding entities, related both to organizing targeted material and knowledge production, but also to advancing the interests of funders, institutions, and individuals. Research acquisition. Here we mean both material resources and financial resources. The work that's done to answer research questions, whether directed towards a publication, a patent, a process, or material product. And finally, evaluation. Product. This refers to the results of research, publications, patents, processes, and material products, but also to career enhancement and to increased power and prestige for institutions and funders. And by market, we're referring to commercial, institutional, military, governmental, and or academic consumption and use. Now, because every link in this complex chain contributes to the content, outcome, and impact of research, we think it's misleading to concentrate questions of integrity on just one aspect in isolation. A holistic approach focused on what Cyrus and I call global integrity chains is required. This approach implies questions like, where did the substances used in research come from, and how are they sourced? Where does research funding come from, and why are some research topics supported and not others? What use are research findings put to? Answering such questions always implicates subjective judgment, requiring reflection and transparency about both our own values and those of all the actors linked in global integrity chains. Values that extend far beyond narrow metrics of output, economic growth, and even societal impact. But rather than explain this didactically, let's turn to two historical cases that illustrate our argument more concretely. Cyrus?
Great. Well, thanks, Lisa. Now, probably many of you saw the movie Oppenheimer this summer. Well, that film does exactly what we're critiquing, right? It narrowly defines atomic weapons research, and it focuses on a limited group of scientific researchers. We're arguing that such narrow definitions not only exclude many thorny issues, but also empower those who employ secrecy, fraud, and denialism. In contrast, scientists who see research as distributed across society and build coalitions with non-scientists can more effectively address both scientific malpractice and other social ills. To see how, let's trace the integrity chain associated with the nuclear materials in the Oppenheimer story. The Manhattan Project's uranium came mostly from the Belgian Congo, a notoriously cruel and exploitative colony. Some also came from Canada and the Western US, where it was mined by indigenous workers whose bodies and communities were poisoned for decades, despite denials from their governments and employers. Exploitation of indigenous communities attended uranium mining globally. Now, miners' health was, in many cases, monitored by occupational health experts, but often in order to generate shoddy evidence that uranium mining was harmless. Geiger counters were positioned in regions of mines where the miners didn't actually work. Cancer statistics lumped miners with engineers and administrators who weren't actually exposed to uranium dust. And high cancer rates were blamed on miners' smoking habits rather than their working conditions. Such tricks worked because miners' knowledge of their own bodies wasn't regarded as research, and they couldn't speak as experts. Skip disposal of waste, but I think you can see from this picture that dealing with waste often wasn't done in ways that drew on the collaboration, the research capacity of the affected communities. Then there's exposure in uranium mills, which in some cases was almost as bad as in the mines. Yet governments and companies obscured those hazards, up to and including murdering workers like Karen Silkwood, a whistleblower at an Oklahoma uranium mill who died while driving to deliver her research on workplace contamination to a journalist. So one of our arguments is that any conception of open science should include solidarity with researchers like Karen Silkwood, but also that we shouldn't think of science as the kind of contained thing that has a door that can be open or closed to people like Silkwood. Returning to Oppenheimer, we should remember that the Manhattan Project employed around 500,000 people over the course of its lifetime, not just the handful of scientists at Los Alamos. Plus, of course, many indirect contributions from those people's communities. Yet Oppenheimer and most scientists saw workers and communities as making unskilled, non-expert contributions, which meant that they had no say in the making and use of the bomb. Nuclear strategy was to be guided by the science. But once you narrowly define research, where some people are scientists and the rest are society, then you empower people who are willing to use denialism, secrecy, and fraud to ensure that the science agrees with their politics and nobody can challenge them. That's the lesson I draw from Oppenheimer's security clearance hearings. His opponents' distortions worked because everyone, including Oppenheimer, accepted that scientists do science, society does politics. So Oppenheimer's disagreements with hawkish scientists like Edward Teller were politically suspect because the science had already been established, or so people like Teller claimed, and no one could really challenge him. But in fact, there is no bright line between science and society, and solidarity across that continuum is one of the best defenses for research integrity. So a final example illustrating that point. In the 1950s debate about above-ground nuclear testing, Teller argued that fallout from testing posed no risks, using tropes that would later be borrowed by climate change denialists, arguing that fallout is swamped by natural radiation, that individual risk from fallout is too small to measure, that testing would continue whether any single country stopped. In Teller's estimation, no deaths would ever be traced to testing, whereas his opponents argued that by the late 1950s, in fact, testing was already responsible for thousands of premature deaths. But only Teller had access to the relevant classified data, so his claims initially had more authority. Indeed, US Atomic Energy Commission scientists had evidence contradicting Teller, which they were barred from publishing. So a coalition of scientists and non-scientists started a campaign for children to mail in their baby teeth for analysis for isotopes prevalent in nuclear fallout. That is, Teller's opponents made research part of society to make data public, a brilliant move which contributed directly to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. Now, simultaneously, Teller was promoting plans to carve a harbor in northern Alaska using controlled nuclear explosions. And at first, Alaska elites enthusiastically supported Teller, partly because they accepted his claims that the site was devoid of human and animal life. In fact, there was a thriving indigenous community there, situated near abundant whale and caribou, which would have been irradiated by Teller's plans. That community was, of course, aware of the danger, and they publicized it with the help of two University of Alaska biologists who had been contracted by the Atomic Energy Commission to study the site, and whose research the AEC had fraudulently misreported. When those biologists defied the AEC and made their original findings public, they received permanent bans on academic employment in the United States. Yet their brave willingness to work with indigenous and environmental groups to treat their research as part of society stoked opposition that forced Teller to abandon his plans.
So our second example focuses on the metal manganese. Its history reveals a globally entangled web of actors, practices, initiatives, and consequences, and shows that while we usually think of research as carried out in a single place or networked set of dedicated research sites, its complete arc also includes locations including mines, factories, industry associations, governmental planning commissions, military procurement offices, and NGOs. Tracking integrity, then, means attending to a heterogeneous range of places, actors, activities, and relations. A bit of history now. Chemists first isolated manganese in the 1770s, though its compounds had long been used for dyeing and in glass making. By the mid-18th century, research revealed its qualities as a chemical reagent, and its subsequent use in the production of chlorine and similar bleaching agents helped revolutionize textile manufacture. By the early 19th century, research also demonstrated its ability to increase the hardness of steel, and manganese has continually been taken up in the development of batteries, various kinds of batteries, since the late 19th century. As you all know, I think, manganese is essential to human health, but overexposure is toxic. A problem that has been was repeatedly discovered and forgotten by medical researchers with each wave of innovation involving manganese between the 1830s and 1930s. Now, it'd be easy to blame these cycles of discovery and forgetting on a lack of modern research communications media. But the isolated cases of neurological damage suffered by male industrial laborers, which were punctuatedly studied by medical researchers during that century from 1830 to 1930, that pales in comparison to the extensive problems and pollution that accompanied the spread of manganese mining to meet the demands of industry both then and since. Now, increasing growth and demand for battery-powered laptops, mobile phones, electric vehicles, and the like means that manganese is even more sought after now than before. R&D professionals have turned to it for a new generation of batteries, both because of the geopolitical challenges of maintaining access to lithium and cobalt, and because the greater availability of manganese makes its purchase price relatively cheap. But this techno fix ignores the human and environmental costs borne by mine workers and their local surroundings, the very same kinds of costs attached to the sourcing of lithium, cobalt, and other so-called essential metals. Once again, we find research caught up in cycles of discovery and forgetting, mediated by both time and geography. So while R&D professionals are thus part of the same research chain as faraway workers who apply their knowledge and skill to unearth and refine needed metals, distance and the intervention of other profit-seeking links in the chain facilitate selective blindness to the true costs associated with research. One place where we can witness this, going back more than a century, is the country of Georgia. On the eve of World War I, a single Georgian mine produced half of the world's manganese output. This is the Chiatura mine. The 20th century's volatile history meant pendulum-like swings for the fortunes of both that mine and Georgia, with the so-called Rose Revolution of 2003 marking the end of Soviet rule. With the United States and organizations such as the IMF encouraging fundamental changes, the new government pushed through sweeping liberalization. Economic growth targets, set in keeping with research from IMF economists, translated directly into more precarious working conditions for manganese miners who saw their working hours extended, safety conditions compromised, and wages reduced when production quotas weren't met. Subsequent changes at Chiatura in 2016 subjected miners to even worse working and living conditions. Here are a couple of images to show that. Now, research by IMF economists, which undergirded the Georgian government's plan to alleviate poverty by, quote, improving the country's business climate, unquote, not only led to harsher conditions for the country's miners, but also to further environmental degradation. Residents near the mine finally organized protests and a hunger strike in 2021, demanding compensation for environmental damage wrought by manganese mining. A shadowy settlement with the British mine owners solved little, as the integrity of dwellings, water supplies, and air quality continues to suffer from work at the mine. By February of this year, mine workers went on strike again to protest what they called inhuman working conditions. The strike recently ended, just in the middle of the summer, but we'll see whether the owners fulfill their promises of reform. Now, strikingly, this story and parallel accounts of the grinding poverty, precarious working conditions, and environmental degradation that accompany manganese mining in South Africa, now the major supplier, and elsewhere, along with the research that documents them, this all seems to exist in a separate universe from the one described in reports about researchers seeking exciting new uses for manganese in their pristine laboratories. Especially given the geopolitical dilemmas surrounding lithium and cobalt, widely available manganese beckons as a savior for the green transition. But how long, we ask, can research into manganese's technological potential and the institutions that support it be kept separate from concerns for workers' rights and environmental justice?
Okay. So obviously our examples taken from materials and energy research leave many issues untouched. A prominent gap in our coverage, for instance, is the neglect of the humanities and social sciences, other than those economists at the IMF. We've also avoided talking about what comes next. Historians are good at producing examples that trouble conventional wisdom, but we're less well equipped to propose solutions for the future. That said, we think whatever comes next should be broadly debated, not just by the types of people in this room, but in a way that acknowledges that research is widely distributed in society. Now, that will be an uncomfortable process. Our talk has highlighted some bad acts by scientists and their patrons. We present those examples in a spirit of friendly critique, meant to spur self-reflection. But we recognize that similar examples are frequently employed by people who seek to destroy scientists' capacity for independent expertise because it threatens their profits and privileges. We reject and deplore such attacks on science, and nothing we've said should be taken as implying that most scientists act irresponsibly or that only scientists are capable of committing breaches of research integrity. Obviously, those who do their own research by watching YouTube videos on vaccines or climate science are not necessarily acting with responsibility or integrity. Rather, we're arguing that broad coalitions and solidarity among the diverse people who are concerned with research integrity, broadly defined, should deliver better outcomes both for society writ large and even for research integrity in the narrow sense defined by the European Code of Conduct that Lisa started with. We also argue that potential coalitions become more visible and imaginable if we trace the global chain of research integrity issues. Scientists directly occupy only a few links in that chain, but are mutually interdependent with everyone else on that chain. And the same political and economic forces operate across the whole chain, such that those forces that encourage authorship fraud and fabrication of scientific results also encourage exploitation of the workers and societies that produce research materials and discourage the social mobility that, among other things, would bring fresh talent and perspectives into science. Confronting scientific fraud separately is therefore treating the symptom, not the cause. And in treating the cause, we could and should search widely for additional expertise and assistance. And thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are a little bit late in the schedule, but we will still take time for questions. So do we have any questions in the room? Yes, so I see one here in the front and one in the back. So first one who has a microphone can start. Okay, please introduce yourself before asking your question.
That's me. Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Koen Jonkers. I work in the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and I'm fairly new to this field. And I understood from the first set of speakers this morning that there was a clear link between research integrity and research quality. How I understood research integrity and scientific integrity and research ethics, I understood that there were two communities and that there was a distinction between the two. And in my perception, the examples that you gave would be traditionally more be in the field of research ethics rather than scientific integrity, which deals more with the praxis of research. Do I understand your talk, your argument well, that in your broad definition you argue for a conflation of scientific ethics and research integrity, or do I misunderstand that? Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly, I would say maybe not a conflation, but certainly a significant overlap. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I have another question here. Please, you need to have the microphone so that people online can hear you. Thank you.
My name is Rose Bernabe from University of Oslo. I guess my question is very much related to that. Yeah, so the first impression is, of course, when we start widening the definition of research, that we start conflating research integrity and research ethics, but also maybe the whole issue of ethics and justice, right? So then we have like really broad fields of area. And I guess the challenge is not so much are we now afraid of redefining research because of this conflation, or maybe we research ethicists, research integrity experts, or ethics experts should start defining which area of research we cover once we start widening research. So I don't know if you have had thoughts about this, reflections on this, because you've widened the field of research, but have you also somehow have had reflected on which areas should research integrity cover, which areas should research ethics cover, and which areas should ethics and the whole issue of justice cover within this wider definition of research?
This is on, right? Yeah. So I think maybe to begin with, it should be said that our talk was meant to lead to more reflection. Operationalization is always different, but our concern is that if the focus is on a limited group of people known as researchers, and it's assumed that you have the content. So our first speaker in this section, she showed a quadrant in which one thing referred to pure science. If you look at science or knowledge first in isolation and then talk about its relationship with the context, that's going to lead you in a very different direction than questions about ethics and integrity are going to focus in a much too narrow way rather than recognizing that from the very start, the very design of research, the very choice of topics, where it's done. I mean, let's remember, for example, that the majority of research is not done in academic settings, but rather out in the corporate world. So I think our point is just that we have to maybe take a step back and think first about how we're defining and setting boundaries about what we're doing.
One quick thing to add. So I think what I was just trying to get across in my examples is that if you separate ethics and integrity, you actually empower people like Edward Teller and his allies who are willing to do scientifically questionable things for unethical ends.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I would now like to see if there are some questions online from our online participants. And I see no raised hands. So I suggest that we continue this discussion over coffee. So now we will take a break until 11:30 before joining parallel session. Thank you very much to all the speakers and thank you for this discussion.